Hey everyone, this is the lecture that goes along with Chapter 7 in the Chapin book. Chapter 7 is the chapter on civil rights. And civil rights, by and large, are the rights that extend or provide protection to people on the basis of, so that they're not discriminated on the basis of age or race, gender, socioeconomic status, religious preference, sexual orientation, gender expression, ethnicity, educational status, so on and so forth. Um, Chapin makes the argument, and I think it's a pretty convincing one in the chapter, that since the U.S. is home to such a diverse array of cultures and races and ethnicities, um, the the role of these rights is to provide protection so that everyone sort of has an equal chance to make a life in the United States, and that it's her argument is essentially that it's the expression of these different diversity statuses that makes our country so interesting, and so she's pretty adamant about sort of social workers working to protect these rights. She highlights the idea of social justice, and I think the sort of pursuit of civil rights has been sort of a key player, or sort of a key component in our pursuit, our profession's pursuit of social justice. So the two big groups that I'm going to focus on here today from the chapter are um, um, I'm going to focus on racial injustice, and then I'm going to focus on injustice related to LGBT status. That just provides sort of a snapshot of some of the things that are covered in the chapter. So obviously the about a quarter of African Americans and a quarter of Latinos are poor in the U.S. That's despite the fact that they make up a much smaller proportion of the population. So, what we can say is that there's actually a disparity. If there was parity, the same percentage that is poor would be the same percentage of the population that a group makes up. But because those numbers are different, we would say that there's a disparity. Um, so you can see some income numbers there, but this obviously extends to things like education status as well. So 30% of non-Hispanic whites had a bachelor's degree. For African Americans, it was 20%. For Hispanics, it was 14%. The schools are highly segregated. 40% of African American and 40% of Latino students were in schools that were overwhelmingly classified as minority enrollment. The real issue with minority enrollment schools is that they have fewer certified teachers. They tend to have lower budgets and limited sort of extracurricular activities, things like art and music and gym class, sports teams, field trips, so on and so forth. This is a slide, just I think, sort of that sort of highlights um, really the perniciousness of racial injustice. Um, Life expectancy is much lower um, for for non-Hispanic Black uh, populations. You can see kind of in the graph here. Um, Interestingly, Hispanics have some of the longest life expectancy, um, which is really quite wonderful. But as you can see, non-Hispanic Blacks are, whether we're talking both sexes, males or females, are lagging behind other groups, as well as the mean, pretty significantly. Um, and then, of course, the injustice sort of extends to dropout. Dropout for Latino students is about 3 times what it is for white students, and people of color are sort of overwhelmingly the victims of hate crimes. Um, and these numbers are actually fairly dated, and they've increased actually since 2016. This let me see where I can. I'll put myself up here. Um, So this is a slide on civil rights and criminal justice. And what you see here is sort of the disparity is extended to issues that incorporate the criminal justice system. So people of color are about 30% of the U.S. population. They're about 60% of those imprisoned. Again, if this number had parity, we would expect these numbers to be roughly equivalent. But since they're wildly different, there's such a disparity. It's about 1 in 15 African American men and 1 in 36 Hispanic men are incarcerated. And if you compare that to white men, it's about 1 in every 106 white men are in prison. That disparity sort of extends to youth. African American youth have their cases overwhelmingly moved to adult courts. And they're often sent to adult prisons, presumably where rates of victimization are pretty high. And this is, you can see in the second bullet point here, this is despite the fact that about 16% of African American youth are about 16% of the youth population. Women are 3 times more likely to be incarcerated. Hispanic women are about 70% more likely than white women to be incarcerated. This bullet point here has sort of always kind of shocked me. African American populations comprise about 14% of the drug users, but are about 37% of those arrested for drug offenses. So they're more likely to be arrested, and they're arrested at disproportionate rates. Black offenders also get much longer sentences than white offenders, even when the crime is the same. So the two key civil rights acts to know are the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which we'll talk about next. So what did the Civil Rights Act of 1964 do? Well, it outlawed discrimination in employment and public accommodations. It barred sort of an unequal application of voter registration requirements. So what that means is that if people in a state have to satisfy X requirement for voting, then that had to be applied across the board. So an example of that is most states you can vote when you're 18, and so that has to be enforced uniformly. It can't be 18 for one group and 19 or 20 or 21 for another group. The Civil Rights Act also encouraged school desegregation, and it created sort of a federal basis for the government to stop discrimination. And then lastly, it created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was really sort of the first major piece of legislation since Reconstruction that permitted access to the ballot box for African American populations. It outlawed literacy tests, so you could vote even if you couldn't pass a literacy test, and that again is sort of a throwback to the educational disparity that exists between populations of color and white populations. And then it required the federal government to sort of monitor election practices, so that there was no discrimination. The good thing is that in the immediate wake of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, there was a significant increase in voter registration among people of color. And then in the long term, there was an increase in elected officials among populations of color. And if the social work profession has typically viewed both of those outcomes as positive changes. In 1975, the Voting Rights Act was amended to protect non-native English speakers. And of course, today we hear an awful lot about the sort of threats to voting rights. So there's pretty serious threats to voting rights going on. There's voter ID laws. There's removing people from rolls, people who haven't voted in a while. Um, that's presumably done to sort of uh, clean out the rolls, so, for people that have died or moved out of state, or people who have become infirm and can't vote anymore. And while that's probably reasonable to do, there needs to be a pretty strict test to determine whether or not someone should be removed from a voting a voting role. There's proof of citizenship amendments being required. There's restrictions on early voting. There's there's attempts to limit, or I guess they've actually succeeded, but felons are disbarred from voting, and there's actually people trying to reinstate that. The argument being that once a felon has been released from prison, he or she has done their time and sort of satisfied their debt to society, so they should be allowed to vote again. Florida was actually one of the very first places to sort of reinstate the right of felons to vote. And of course, this would have a big impact on communities of color, since they're disproportionately the ones sent to prison for crimes. Things like gerrymandering are also sort of attempts to limit the influence of certain groups, and so I would, even though that's not listed here, I would incorporate or I would include gerrymandering in a threat to voting rights today. There are the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of the 60s both had sort of very strong community elements. And of course, when you think about civil rights, the person that should come to mind first is probably Martin Luther King Jr. He really led a community of people to attempt to make those changes. And most people would argue that the strong sense of community that exists in African American communities had a lot to do with why Martin Luther King sort of tapped into that particular strength in the community in order to get that done. There are, of course, ways to use the strengths perspective to sort of protect and meet the challenges. They have to do with community building and asking for accountability and enforcement, focusing on outcomes, enhancing community power, and things like that. But it's really the United States Constitution that provides sort of this overarching framework for justice. And this is one of the very first, or the first document that we have that provides for a sense of justice. So the Bill of Rights, which are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, the first 10 articles of the Constitution, is sort of the foundation of civil rights protection. Subsequent amendments to the Constitution have expanded civil rights for particular groups, two of which we're talking about here. Yeah, let's move on. Okay, so the second sort of big population we're talking about here today is the LGBTQ population. Sometimes you hear LGBTQ, you hear other sort of letters added on to the end. Sometimes you hear LGBTQQIA, so lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, and allies. I don't think the book is quite that sophisticated. I think she uses primarily LGBTQ and gay rights, but it's probably important that social workers have just sort of a working knowledge of or at least a general sense of where that definition is. So just a quick history of the sort of gay rights movement. This is really happened in sort of the aftermath of the civil rights movement. It started with the Stonewall riots in 1969 in New York City. In 1974, the American Psychological Association removed homosexuality from its official list of mental disorders. And let me correct what I just said. That was not the American Psychological Association. It was the American Psychiatric Association. They're the ones who write the DSM. And so in the 70s, we would have been in DSM-2. But it was the American Psychiatric Association that officially removed it from its list of mental disorders. Social workers were among the first of the sort of big professional, helping professional groups to pass a public policy statement that asked social workers to eradicate eradicate homophobia. And then in the 90s, there was a couple of Supreme Court decisions, I guess the 90s and the 2000s, that provided protections for LGBTQ individuals. The first was in Colorado. That was Romer versus Evans. That's this one here. That was struck down by Colorado. Essentially, what some municipalities were trying to do was bar. I'm sorry. Let me say this again. What the Supreme Court decision did was bar municipalities or prevent municipalities from passing legislation that said people that said municipalities couldn't pass legislation that provided equal protection. So it essentially granted municipalities the right or the sort of freedom to pass those kinds of to pass essentially equal or protectionist measures. The Supreme Court struck down sodomy laws in 2003, essentially saying that same-sex contact was something that could be permitted. And then in 2009, Obama signed the Matthew Shepard in James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act, which extended sort of federal hate crime statutes to include crimes that were motivated by gender, sexual orientation, sexual expression, gender identity, disability, so on and so forth. Heterosexism is still very much alive today. It's noteworthy when an athlete or an entertainer comes out as gay or lesbian or transgender. LGBTQ teens are consistently targeted for bullying and harassment. The rate of suicide attempts and suicidality among LGBTQ teens is many, many times that of straight teens. Transgendered individuals lack civil rights in some areas, and there have been sort of executive movements to try and reduce their rights even further. And then 36 of 50 states still have statutes prohibiting same-sex marriage, and 30 states have constitutional amendments prohibiting same-sex marriage. So that's more than half in both of those things. Move myself down here again real quick. So a couple of sort of what the book calls fronts in the struggle. So one of these has to do with marriage equality, and there's generally sort of a movement towards reframing the debate away from gay marriage into something called marriage equality. The support for marriage equality has more than doubled in the last 20 years. It's been really sort of a remarkable sociological shift in how we've viewed marriage equality. The Obama administration sort of is the one that decided that the Defense of Marriage Act was unconstitutional, and then of course the Trump administration is trying to revive that as well. And so, for as much progress as there was during the Obama administration, there's been quite a bit of setback during the Trump administration. The 4 years or so, of the 3.5 years of the Trump administration. Another sort of front in the struggle is accommodations in healthcare. that strangely seems to envelop sort of gender neutral restrooms or sort of single occupancy restrooms. For a long time in healthcare, you wouldn't have been able to visit a patient, a person in the hospital, unless um, you were that person's family member or spouse by marriage. And so Obama was the one who actually changed that so that civil unions and same-sex partners and so on and so forth could be permitted to visit. And then, of course, that sort of led to civil unions and same-sex partners being able to make healthcare decisions and for their loved ones, things like that. And then, of course, military service is sort of the next front in the struggle. Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which really found its sort of had its genesis in the Clinton administration in the 90s, officially ended in 2011. Of course, there have been some high-profile cases of transgender individuals serving in the military and ending up in prison for whistleblowing activities. But this sort of continues to be a debate among a lot of people. Should LGBTQ populations be permitted to serve in the military? The argument opposed to it typically has to do with unit cohesion and morale, and things like that. And the argument for it really is much more of a has really much more of sort of a latent goal, and that's making the military into a system or a group that's sort of as progressive or reflects the same values as the rest of society. And then I think adoption, hate crimes, I guess, is the last one we're going to talk about. So adoption and parenting is sort of another front in the struggle. So there was a famous case where a child adopted in New York couldn't get a birth certificate in Louisiana. That was Adar versus Smith. Another one, Catholic Charities versus Illinois. This is actually part of the reason why Catholic Charities no longer does adoption things. Catholic Charities wanted to exclude same-sex couples and couples in civil unions. So I think the court document said civil unions, but that was presumably same-sex couples, because they sort of the only union available to them at the time would have been a civil union. And the courts ruled in favor of the state of Illinois, and then Catholic Charities shut down their adoption program. Hate crimes are up. All but 5 states have a hate crime or have a law that sort of provides for special penalties for crimes based on sexual orientation. Most of those states, though, most states don't have things like gender identity or protection for gender identity, gender expression, things like that. So there's wide variation in what hate crime statutes cover. Then there's a number of states that collect data on hate crimes but don't add penalties for crimes, so they don't add to the sentence at all. So I guess we'll end here. So the next thing that we're trying to do is, and social workers are actually heavily involved in this, is to end discrimination in employment, or promote non-discrimination in employment. 21 states and DC have non-discrimination statutes, but that still would be 39 states that don't. There are relatively few complaints, which is probably a good thing, but still the enactment of those laws is more symbolic in nature and sort of signals a state's evolution or progress. Most big Fortune 500 companies have non-discrimination policies, and not quite 2/3, about 60% have policies that include gender identity. It seems like there's some momentum in this kind of thing. You also see businesses sort of putting their dollars where um, towards certain social causes. So when North Carolina was going to pass some bathroom bills, I think the NBA pulled out. Some companies canceled some meetings and things like that, and so you see sort of this sense of corporate activism, which is a good thing. And then the sort of big issue has been, can statutes, uh, do they extend to private institutions? And so private institutions historically have been able to do whatever it is they want. And these are private institutions like Boy Scouts, Catholic Charities, some companies, so on and so forth. And so uh, a person may have protection, but those protections would essentially stop once the purview of that that private institution sort of took over. And so their sort of last sort of front in the struggle is, how do we legislate um, so that people's rights are protected and private institutions still have some degree of self determination. So I will end it there. As always, thanks for watching.